History often remembers heroes who stood against tyranny. But today, we look at the faces of Imperial Japan's war machine, Emperor Hirohito and General Hideki Tojo. Their decisions led to some of the bloodiest chapters of the 20th century, from the attack on Pearl Harbor to the devastation of Asia. This is the story of how ambition and ideology pushed a nation into war, and ultimately into ruin. In the early 20th century, Japan transformed from an isolated nation into a modern military power. Hirohito ascended the throne in 1926 as the so-called living god of Japan. While many saw him as a symbolic figurehead, behind the curtain, militarists were tightening their grip on power. Yes, that is correct. Upon ascending the throne on December 25, 1926, following the death of his father, Emperor Taisho, Hirohito was indeed revered by many Japanese as a living god. This belief stemmed from Shinto traditions that considered the emperor a descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, and thus divinely ordained. This perception was particularly strong during the early part of his reign, which was known as the Showa era, and played a significant role in the rise of Japanese militarism and the subsequent World War II. In traditional Japanese belief, the emperor was not just a ruler, but a spiritual figure, embodying the nation and its connection to the divine. Hirohito's reign saw Japan transform from a relatively isolated nation to a major global power, engaging in expansionist policies and ultimately participating in World War II. Among them stood General Hideki Tojo, a career soldier, ruthless, disciplined, and deeply committed to Japanese expansionism. Was a general of the Imperial Japanese Army, the leader of the Imperial Rule Assistance Association, and the 40th Prime Minister of Japan during most of World War II. By the 1930s, Japan had already invaded Manchuria and launched a brutal campaign in China. Both Hirohito and Tojo supported these actions, believing Japan's destiny was to dominate Asia. Japan had few natural resources and a rapidly increasing population. She determined to take the raw materials and living space that she wanted by force. Western reaction was disheartening. The League of Nations protested, and President Hoover applied meaningless moral sanctions. Not surprisingly, the Japanese ignored both the League and Hoover. The campaign went well, and the militarists became the controlling factor in Japanese politics. As usual, it was the ordinary people who paid the price. The orgy of burning, looting, and mass murder which accompanied the Japanese onslaught aroused anger and sympathy in the democracies, but no action. This bloody war would drag on for 13 bitter years, and through it all moved the refugees. But the very poor and the helpless remained, too threatened, too frightened, or too helpless even to move. Hirohito approved the War Cabinet's decisions, including Tojo's plan for a surprise attack on the United States. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes bombed Pearl Harbor, dragging the U.S. into World War II. Across Asia, Japanese forces swept through Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia, leaving a trail of massacres and atrocities. The Nanjing Massacre, forced labor camps, human experiments by Unit 731, these horrors were carried out under their rule. Tojo was the Iron Fist, executing orders without hesitation. Hirohito, though quieter, was no innocent bystander. His approval gave legitimacy to the entire campaign. In late 1937, over a period of 6 weeks, Imperial Japanese Army forces brutally murdered hundreds of thousands of people, including both soldiers and civilians, in the Chinese city of Nanjing, or Nanking. The horrific events are known as the Nanjing Massacre, or the Rape of Nanjing, as tens of thousands of women and girls were sexually assaulted. Fearful of losing his military forces in battle, China's nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek ordered the removal of nearly all official Chinese troops from the city, leaving it defended by untrained auxiliary troops. Chiang also ordered the city held at any cost and forbade the official evacuation of its citizens. Many ignored this order and fled, but the rest were left to the mercy of the approaching enemy. On December 1st, the Chinese government abandoned Nanjing, leaving the International Committee in charge. All remaining citizens were ordered into the safety zone for their protection. On December 13th, the first troops of Japan's Central China Front Army, commanded by General Matsui Iwane, entered the city. Even before their arrival, word had begun spreading of the numerous atrocities they had committed on their way through China, including killing contests, arson, and pillaging. Chinese soldiers were hunted down and killed by the thousands and left in mass graves. Many of the Japanese troops, hungry, undisciplined, and exhausted by weeks of marching and brutal fighting in the battle for Shanghai, were seeking revenge for the comrades lost in that earlier battle. Entire families were massacred, and even the elderly and infants were targeted for execution, while tens of thousands of women were raped. Bodies littered the streets for months after the attack. Determined to destroy the city, the Japanese looted and burned at least 1/3 of Nanjing's buildings. According to numerous eyewitness reports and later analyses, between 20,000 and 80,000 women were brutally raped and tortured, including young girls and elderly women. Many of them, including victims of gang rapes, were mutilated and killed after being assaulted. Though the Japanese initially agreed to respect the Nanjing safety zone, ultimately even these refugees were not safe from vicious attacks. As the tide of war turned, Japan's conquests crumbled. U.S. submarines choked supply lines. Island by island, the Allies pushed back. By 1945, firebombing raids reduced Tokyo to ashes, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki felt the fury of the atomic bomb. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, was a devastating event that reduced a significant portion of the city to ashes. The raid, codenamed Operation Meeting House, involved hundreds of B-29 bombers dropping incendiary bombs, resulting in a massive firestorm that caused widespread destruction and a high number of casualties. It is considered the single deadliest air raid of World War II. Many survivors describe the horror of the firestorm, the destruction of their homes, and the loss of loved ones. Tojo attempted suicide, but survived, later standing trial for war crimes. He was hanged in 1948. Hirohito, however, was spared. The Americans saw him as useful for stabilizing Japan, and so the living god became a constitutional monarch, forever silent about the true extent of his wartime role. After Japan's unconditional surrender in 1945, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur ordered the arrest of 40 individuals suspected of war crimes, including Tojo. 5 American soldiers were sent to serve the arrest warrant. The first meeting between Emperor Hirohito and General Douglas MacArthur, the iconic photograph of the two men, with MacArthur in casual attire towering over the formally dressed emperor, became a powerful symbol of the new reality for the Japanese people. The meeting took place shortly after Japan's surrender and the start of the Allied occupation. MacArthur, as Supreme Commander of the Allied powers, was now in charge of governing Japan. MacArthur viewed the emperor's endorsement of the new constitution as a key factor in its acceptance by the Japanese people. Hirohito and Tojo remind us that wars are not only fought by soldiers on the front lines, but also by leaders in polished uniforms and palaces. One spoke softly, the other barked orders, but together they pushed a nation into catastrophe. Millions paid the price. History calls them villains, not just for what they did, but for what they allowed. You've just watched the Villain series. where we uncover the darker side of military history. If you want to understand not only the heroes, but also the forces of evil they stood against, subscribe to Military Tribute Channel. And remember, soldier, those who ignore the past are doomed to see it repeated.